All right, well, it is noon. Hi, everybody. Welcome to First Friday. So glad to have you all with us today. I'm Carol Easterly. I'm one of the museum program coordinators here at the Kentucky Historical Society. And very excited about our program today. We've still got some folks trickling in here. So just to kind of review what we want, there's a bunch of stuff happening here at the Kentucky Historical Society we want you to know about. So I'll just take the opportunity to let you know about those things. Do plan to join us for next month's First Friday. Our speaker will be Dr. Samantha Niekamp from the University of Cincinnati. And she has written about community newspapers and literacy in Appalachia, which really challenging some of those Appalachian stereotypes that we see too much of. So she will be joining us. We also still have summer camp going on in person. We're excited about that. And there are still spots available in our July camps. I get to help teach those this year, so that's going to be fun. So please, if you know somebody with kids or grandkids that's looking for something to do over the summer, we're having a good time here at the Kentucky Historical Society summer camps. We also want you to know about our walking tours that we're doing this summer in downtown Frankfort. Those meet at 1:30 p.m. every Saturday on the steps of the old state capitol. Those have been a lot of fun. So please, if you haven't taken one of those tours yet, consider coming to visit us on a Saturday. They are included with paid admission. If you're a member of KHS, of course, there's no charge for admission. So we'd love to see you. Okay. So even though I think we might still have some folks here still trickling in, I'm going to go ahead and try to get our program started. Do just remember kind of our Zoom etiquette. Most of you have joined us before. So you know we want to try to keep everybody on mute throughout the program just so we don't have background noise interrupting us or anything like that. Please feel free to put questions and comments in the chat feature. That's the little conversation bubble icon down at the bottom of your screen. And you can do that throughout the program. We'll save questions for the end and I'll share those with the speaker. We'd love for you to keep your camera on if you want to. I know a lot of folks might be eating lunch and that's fine too. But we do like to see your smiling face if you want to have your camera on. Just remember, hi, Margaret. Do remember we can all see you. So, and of course, please, throughout the program, we want to treat all participants, the speaker and the moderator with courtesy and respect. Okay, so I'm actually really excited to introduce our speaker for today's program. Even more excited to read his book, A Shot in the Moonlight, which came out earlier this year in January. Oh, Jessica's got her copy right there. Ben's a journalist by trade, but growing up in Oklahoma, he actually wanted to be a farmer, which I think is great. That all changed when he was at Arkansas Tech University, where in addition to studying journalism, he actually played defensive back for the football team. And he's reported for a number of different papers in different parts of the country, most recently for the Tampa Bay Times. And during his tenure there, he was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative reporting on the Dozier School for Boys. He uncovered years of abuse, and his research led to unmarked graves actually being uncovered there at the site, that reform school, which is in North Florida, I believe. And so he's brought that kind of investigative spirit into some of his other projects as well. He's published books on lots of different, very interesting people. A Filipino woman who suffered from leprosy but spied for the United States during World War II. Also, he's written about a Texas man who walked backwards around the world during the Great Depression, and Grandma Gatewood, who was the first woman to through hike the Appalachian Trail. She was 67 years old when she did so, which is pretty amazing. And luckily for us, his most recent project has him digging into Kentucky history. So I am excited to find out what he's uncovered. So without further ado, Ben, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And so So good to be here. You can probably tell by my black eye that I'm not a historian.
You're cooler than us.
Forgive me, but I took a spill on my bicycle the other day. I live in Tampa, Florida, where I'm coming to you today. I was riding at night, and I didn't see, but actually not far, I should have known this, not far from my house, there was a live oak root that had grown up through some asphalt, and it caught me off guard. What I'm able to recollect of this is that's the culprit. But I came down on my head and my shoulder. And so I've been suffering for the past few days, and I have some memory loss associated with this event. I'm not sure how much. So I'm hoping that I'm able to, this is my first public book talk since then. So I'm hoping that it all comes through and I don't sound like a total buffoon. If I do, please let me know, because I'll need to, have some brain surgery or something to try to bring these memories back. But for real, thank you so much for hosting this. It's very good to see you all. I knew so little about Kentucky. Having grown up in Oklahoma, studied in Arkansas. I worked in newspapers in West Texas, and then went from there to upstate New York, and then from there down to Florida, somehow avoiding Kentucky for most of my adult life. But for the past 3 years or so, I've had the lovely opportunity to explore your state and to meet a lot of the people there and to dig into what I think is this very interesting story. I'll tell you a little about the genesis before I get into this story. And by the way, let me just mention from the get-go, if you have any questions throughout this, I think the best way to handle that is probably to put them in the chat. And we'll leave some time to address those questions later on in the program. I was working for the Tampa Bay Times in 2014, around the time of the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Just as that started to make the national news and as protests kicked off both in Ferguson and cities across the country. And I was paying attention, like all of you were, I'm sure, to some of that. And I read in the Washington Post, in an editorial in the Washington Post, that nobody kept track of police shootings in the United States in any kind of sort of statistical way. But the Department of Justice did, and the FBI didn't. Many states didn't even keep track for themselves. And this upset me as a human being. How do we know how to respond to events like the shooting of Michael Brown when there's no statistical information to tell us if that is an outlier or if that's something that's common? And so without the data and without the science, how do we know how to respond? And this is what I was having a hard time with. Should we be protesting police brutality against Black people if we don't know that police are shooting Black people at a rate that's higher than they're shooting white people, et cetera? And so I was just sort of riffing on this in a staff meeting at the Tampa Bay Times. I had just done a story about like a little blurb, we call it back of the book information, about the number of purse snatchings in the state of Florida, which I was able to find by searching about 3 minutes. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement could tell me how many purse snatchings there were in all of 2009, but it turns out they couldn't say how many times police had fired a gun and killed or injured a civilian, a citizen. And so this was 2014. That was just sort of, it made me angry a little bit. Like, why don't we keep track of these things? And so I'm riffing about this in a staff meeting, and my boss, my editor, said, well, why don't you tell us how many police shootings there were in Florida? And I thought, well, maybe that's something I could do. When really, for a reporter, if you're just mad about something and you're bringing it to a meeting like that, like oftentimes you want amnesty over the idea. You want somebody else to do that hard work, to count those police shootings. But in this case, it fell upon me. It was my beef. And so it was my job. And so I started poking around. It turns out about 3 years later, we published a project called Why Cops Shoot. And it accounted for 6 years of police shootings in the state of Florida. And the essence of it was about 138 people a year get shot by police in the state of Florida. About half of those are, this is the third largest state in the country, 20 million residents. And about half of those are fatal shootings. And what we came away with was about 40% of those shootings, the person who is shot is Black. And so that sort of gave us some, some statistics upon which to write. That's way out of whack with the population of the Black population of Florida, which hovers around 15 or 16%. But in the process of doing this hard work, and it meant asking almost 400 police agencies for 6 years worth of shooting reports, I came to meet and to spend a lot of time with a woman named Natasha Clemens, who lost her son to police violence in Sarasota. It's a case you probably never heard of. Rodney Mitchell shot late one night, driving home. The police accused him of not wearing a seatbelt, which is why they pulled him over. For all intents and purposes, he did absolutely nothing wrong. And this wound up in a terrible, tragic thing. And his mother, Natasha Clemens, had to deal with this grief, not just the grief of like losing her son to police, but the grief of existing in a city where those same officers who killed her son were returned to the force and not found to have done anything wrong, and to continue to police their community. And so this was especially difficult for her. And through her, I wound up spending a lot of time with a lot of other Black mothers who get together once in a while, typically on the anniversary of their loved one's death, to hold signs, sometimes in cities where there's no press attention, where nobody even notices. There are no real, these aren't the cases that fire up all of us, the killing of George Floyd, and they're in Kentucky, Breonna Taylor, and so forth. These are killings that go overlooked, and because they happen in small towns, and for whatever reason, the national media doesn't take notice. And so there were about 300 of these mothers in the state of Florida who deal with the same kind of grief. And not all of them are their mothers. Some of them, husbands have been killed, nephews and nieces have been killed. But by and large, I did a story for the Times. I spent a lot of time with these women trying to understand their plight. And also I wound up meeting some people like Sandra Bland, the mother of, the victim was Sandra Bland, but you know this name from a police stop in Texas that went bad. She wound up in jail and allegedly committed suicide in a jail cell, even though there's suspicion about that. I met her mother, and I wound up just kind of as a human being in the reporting of all this, being feeling like just this, feeling their grief, by extension. And it's a hard thing to live with. Like anytime I approach a story like that, especially one that takes 3 years to report out, I want to put myself in the shoes of everyone involved, including the police officers, including the mothers of the victims and so forth. And so dealing with that for me took a real personal toll. And I started longing for a story that didn't end in that kind of tragedy. And in some ways, I started longing for a story that I would be able to tell that would let me explore a situation where someone had defended himself or herself from violence or threatened violence and had survived the ordeal and had gone after some sort of revenge or justice or retribution. And so I kept my eyes open for, I'm always thinking about what's the next book. I have an agent in New York who's always like, what do you got next, Ben? And so I was thinking about that and living in that and actively looking for a story that I could tell that would let me explore some of these topics. And I never expected to find something that was so sort of cleanly illustrated, so interesting, and that involves such interesting characters, including eventually in this story, which we'll talk about, the man who did more than most people of his era, maybe more than most of any era, to preserve and support the notion, the myth of the lost cause, of the sort of pure chivalry of the Southern soldier fighting in the Civil War. And that man was Bennett Young, a Kentuckian through and through. So through this book, I didn't know that when I first found this story. I just noticed reading back through old archives, newspaper archives, I noticed a very sensational story. I'll tell you in just a moment the bare bones of it, but I didn't know that Bennett Young played such a role in some of the same issues that we're talking about today with Confederate statuary, not just in Kentucky, but all across the United States. How are we to remember the Confederacy? How are we to remember these men who, some of them gave their lives for a cause that they believed in? How are we to honor them? Is that possible? And so this story, I think, let me get into some of those things. So it all started in 1897, in late January, down in Simpson County, Kentucky, southwestern Kentucky, not far from Franklin, about 9 miles from Franklin, in a spot that is now known as Coffee Bottom. If anybody's ever been down in that part of the country, Coffee Bottom, hardly even called that anymore. There's no real sort of centralized settlement down there, no city or municipality to speak of, but some of the people who live there still call it Coffee Bottom. Anyways, on this night in particular, there were about 25 white men who rode up to the home of George Denning, who was a freed slave. He had been born into slavery in 1850. The first public record he created was on the slave roster of 1860, where he was noted as a 5-year-old black boy, no name, just 5, male and black. So Denning had been emancipated with the rest of his family. He had grown up in Simpson County, never left, and began as a teen and into adulthood. He began to farm, to hack out a living in Simpson County. And eventually this led to him purchasing from the man who used to own him and his ancestors, purchasing about 114, somewhere between 114 and 124 acres, paying it off in increments, but paying it off outright eventually, and then farming that acreage and building upon that acreage a 2-story small clapboard shack where he and his wife birthed and raised 11 children. They were there asleep that night. About half the kids were staying in that small dwelling, and then the other half were staying with George Denning's parents up the road, just a piece. And on that night, these 25 white men, most of them neighbors of his from Simpson and neighboring Logan County, rode up to his house. Half of them were armed, and they were there to demand that, according to them, to demand that he leave the county. He had been accused of stealing some livestock from neighboring farms, and there'd been a series of fires of smoke shacks in a couple of different farms surrounding his. And these men were there to sort of regulate. They had met earlier that night and decided George Denning was the culprit in all this, even though he had no criminal record. He knew the sheriff of the county on a first name basis. There's no indication to me, studying the historical record, that he would have been guilty of something like this. It was against what I came to know of his character. But nonetheless, they showed up at his house that night and surrounded the house, hitched their horses to the gate out front, surrounded the house. And then the spokesman of the group, a guy named Doc Moore, stood on his front porch and demanded George Denning come out, shouted inside, woke the family up, demanded Denning come out. but he muffled his voice. He disguised his voice, even though the two men knew each other. So Denning said, "Who's out there?" And the men said, "We're your friends. We just want to have a talk with you." He refused to come out. It's important to remember that this was a period of time when racial lynchings happened like clockwork in Kentucky and in other states further south. It was a regular thing. In fact, almost every day, the newspaper carried an account of some lynching in some different part of the South. So, and this, by the way, is only 5 years after Ida B. Wells, the muckraking journalist in Memphis, Tennessee, whose presses had been burned, who had been threatened with her own life. She wrote in an editorial, the Winchester rifle deserves a place of honor in every Black home to provide for us the protection which the law refuses to provide. She's suggesting the only way sometimes Blacks can protect themselves against this sort of vigilantism is to bear arms, which was, the right. It was the Second Amendment, even for Black people. So she's encouraging people to protect themselves, to own Winchester rifles. Well, George Denning, he refuses to come out of his house, tries to get the men to identify themselves in some way. They say no. Eventually, probably by accident is my best guess, somebody fired through George Denning's back door. And upon hearing that gunshot coming from behind the house, the folks who were standing in the yard in front of the house began to fire into the front of the house. George Denning grabbed his rifle. He was sleeping downstairs in a bed with his wife and 3 or 4 children. He grabbed his rifle. He ran upstairs. As he's running up the stairs, he passes a window and he takes a bullet in the arm as he passes this window. He makes his way up the stairs where there's another window. And as soon as he throws open the shutters to get a look at who's outside, he takes a bullet which grazes his forehead. It enters his head right here, goes under the skin to the top of his head, and then exits the top of his forehead. This happens almost simultaneously as he leans out the window and squeezes off one round of a double shot shotgun. And that bird shot left the barrel and struck and killed the 32-year-old scion of the wealthiest family in Logan County, Kentucky, a man named Jody Kahn. The would-be vigilantes who were there to confront George Denning retreated. They'd been fired upon. They noticed their comrade had fallen off his horse. They grabbed his body, retreated, tried to get him to sit back up on his horse. He couldn't. He bled out right there on George Denning's lawn. They talked for a moment about setting fire to the house and just burning it down upon all of the occupants, but decided against that and instead retreated, took Jody Kahn to try to get him help at a neighbor's house. George Denning, meanwhile, ran out the back of his house, thinking they were there just for him and they would leave his family alone, ran out the back of his house, ran as far as he could, threw himself down in a pasture and hid out under the full moon of January 26, 1897. When he heard the consternation retreat, when he heard the men retreat, they had stopped firing, he ran back to his house. His wife met him at the door with his jacket and his breeches and his boots and his hat. He dressed quickly without saying much, took off, ran to a white neighbor's house, couldn't wake that neighbor, ran to another white neighbor's house, finally woke that neighbor, told him what had happened. He was in a state of confusion, and he was under the impression that his house had been dynamited. Such was the gunfire. And so the first words to this neighbor was, "They threw dynamite on my house." He said it sounded like somebody had cast gravel across the wood floor. The neighbor gave him refuge for the rest of the night. Just before sunrise, he decided to go back and see if he could figure out what was going on with his family. So he makes his way back up the road. In the process, he meets a friend, a Black man named Bob Lucas, and Bob Lucas tells him, "You killed Jody Kahn." This is the first he's heard of that his bullet struck anybody. He said, "You've killed Jody Kahn." George Denning knew Jody Kahn. He had done some work for him. The two were friendly. They had no beef with each other that George Denning knew of, but he now knew that this was a desperate situation. Instead of returning to his home, he immediately headed for Franklin, for the county seat, where Sheriff Clark had also heard of this killing and was waiting for him. He gave his gun to a Black friend on the road in between Coffee Bottom and Franklin. When he arrived in Franklin, he turned himself into the sheriff. The sheriff said, "You're in a little bit of trouble here. There's a mob that's coming after you. This is what I'm hearing." He said, "We're going to try to get you away, but I need you to stay in a jail cell for a little bit." So he checks into the jail in Franklin. By the way, has anybody ever been to that? It's still, the Historical Society down there still holds that old jail. And yeah, it's very cool, and a great active historical society in Simpson County. You can go in the jail cell. If you're lucky enough, somebody will shut the door on you and you can actually feel what it's like to be in this old stone fortress. So anyhow, the sheriff puts George Denning in a jail cell. The mob shows up to get him, and the sheriff says he's not there, lies for him. As soon as the mob looks away, the sheriff secrets him out, puts him in a buggy, and takes him to Bowling Green. By the way, this didn't always happen. More often than not, I think it was the case that the mob showed up and the sheriff said, "Oh, you got me. Here are the keys to the cell." And the mob had their way with, you read about this in the papers that era all the time. The mob had their way with the victim and committed some kind of atrocity to send a message that this should never happen again, that sort of thing. But in this case, the sheriff really protected George Denning. Someone else who had become aware of the incident just in the few hours since it had happened was Bill O'Bradley, the governor of the state of Kentucky, who was a progressive Republican and had won with great support from the Black community in Louisville and other areas of Kentucky. Bradley, from my reading, you can tell he's very concerned. He does not want another lynching to occur in this case. By the way, news has begun to spread, and those first news reports were written in a way that suggested that that this mob of peaceful peacekeepers had been ambushed by, in the language of the time, a Negro desperado. That's how they were written. The Associated Press report, even that ran in regional newspapers, was structured such that it made it seem like the mob was just there to be friends, and and they've been fired upon unjustly. And so this is the first the community becomes aware of this is through the local papers, and it's in this way that's slanted to suggest that it was George Denning who was looking for the violence and not the men who had showed up at his house at midnight to run him off. By the way, I should say that when Denning turned himself in, the mob returned to his home there in Simpson County, and they held hostage his family for the rest of that day. They were hoping he came back, and I think they were hoping they would get him when he came back. And eventually, as night fell, the mob demanded that Molly Denning, George's wife, take their children, all 11 of them, on 2 horses that they owned and ride 50 miles without stopping. That was their order to her. She had no choice. So one of her infant was sick, but in the cold of January, in their threadbare clothes, she loaded up the children on these 2 horses and and rode to some families, to where she had family in Blackjack, Tennessee, across the state line. Meanwhile, as they rode away, the mob doused their home and their barn with kerosene and set fire to their house, their gear house, their barn, and their fields. And so everything these two people had worked for, for the past, since they were emancipated, had gone up in smoke. So when Denning arrives in Bowling Green, there's still talk about the mob following him. He's inspected there by a doctor, by the way, who makes note of the entry wound on his scalp and the exit wound on the top of his head. He makes note in great detail of the bullet mark in Denning's arm. This will later be called up. He'd be called to testify and present that evidence. But Denning in Bowling Green is still under threat from the mob, and the sheriff there decides that his only move is to arm the rest of the prisoners in jail, in the county jail, in the Warren County Jail. And so they pass out rifles thinking that the mob is going to show up, try to steal George Denning, and they give the instruction to the other prisoners that you can fire at will if the mob comes here to get him. So that never happens. The next day, Denning is transferred to Louisville, which is a little safer environment for him, less rural, certainly, bigger, more robust Black population. And he there begins to await trial. An interesting thing happens back home as the sheriff tries to put together a case that might be against Denning, tries to figure out what happened, as the state attorney the circuit attorney tries to understand what the crime is. None of the vigilantes wanted to talk because in order to convict George Denning for killing their friend, they would have to testify to the fact that they had shown up at midnight at the home of a Black man with guns on horseback to convince him to leave the county. And that was illegal. And so admitting that they did that, admitting to, vigilantism, to justice. These men weren't deputized. They weren't operating under the color of the law. They were just his neighbors who were trying to chase a man off his property. And so it took a little while before the case was made, but eventually these guys, after consulting with some lawyers, they all agreed upon the same storyline, and they decided to go to the state attorney and say what they knew. And that information was presented to a grand jury. In July, George Denning returned to Simpson County to be tried. Of course, the jury was all white, but Denning testified. His 12-year-old daughter testified that bullets came through her hair. If you read this, by the way, the case still, the transcript of the case is in the governor's records there in Frankfurt, I think, in the state archives. If you read this transcript, this court transcript, it's very clear that this doesn't play out today in the same way that it did in 1897. But I should mention also that the scene there was very intense and chaotic. Bradley dispatched an armed guard to take care of George Denning and to try to prevent a lynching or some other kind of violence during the trial. During the 3-day trial, there were several attempts at Denning's life. They were unsuccessful, but the National Guard had to stay on their toes. A couple of them got injured scrapping with would-be lynchers. So it was a violent and chaotic time. Nonetheless, the trial goes off without a hitch. Denning is convicted, not of murder, which was his charge, but of manslaughter. And he was sentenced to 7 years hard time in Eddiesville. And so he was sent there right after the trial. As soon as he arrived, the people of Kentucky from all walks of life who'd read about this verdict in their local newspapers all across the state began writing to Governor Bradley saying, this is unjust. this man was doing nothing but protecting himself and his family. The case seemed very clear to all sorts of people. And we're talking about pastors and doctors and lawyers and ferrymen and farmers and people from literally all walks of life in the state of Kentucky wrote letters to the governor, many of them saying things like, look, I'm a former Confederate soldier. I fought for the South. As a basis for what you're reading next, this man, black as he may be, did nothing wrong. He was defending himself and his house from assault. And it pit this notion of like ingrained racism and the idea that black lives didn't matter, were worthless, against the idea that a man in his home should be able to protect himself from any sort of violence. And it turns out that the John Locke castle doctrine, which has been with us from the beginning of society, that won the day. And so many people wrote to the governor saying, this is a miscarriage of justice. This man deserves to be pardoned, including Bennett Young, a guy who was a true son of the South, who was a true son of Kentucky. He had grown up in Jeffersonville County. His father was a slaveholder. He was a landowner. He had a hat factory. Bennett Young had gone to private school. One of his first times to make the news was when somebody ran up an American flag up the flagpole around the time the Civil War broke out. One of his classmates, and Bennett Young scrambled up the flagpole and took the American flag down and replaced it with a Confederate flag. And the two got into a fist fight on the school grounds over which flag should fly atop the flagpole. Kentucky, of course, was not a Southern state. Kentucky was south of the Mason-Dixon line, but it was a neutral state in the Civil War. So there were a lot of different incidents sort of like this, but Bennett Young had picked sides. He had joined up, he had ridden with Morgan's men. I'm going to fast forward this story just a little bit. He'd ridden with Morgan's men into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. He'd been captured. He'd spent some time in Camp Douglas outside of Chicago, where he witnessed some atrocities committed by Northern soldiers. He convinced the Confederacy, the leadership of the Confederacy, to let him run a very interesting operation out of Canada, where he and some cohorts, some young Confederate soldiers, came down out of Canada into New Albans, Vermont, and held hostage the town of New Albans, Vermont, the northernmost action in the Civil War. They held hostage of this town for about 24 hours, tried to burn it down, but their Molotov cocktails didn't work, as they wrote out. But it had the purpose of trying to convince the Yankees to check out their northern border, to redirect their attention from the Mason-Dixon line to the north. It didn't necessarily work. They wound up spending some time in Canadian prison and then eventually fled for Europe. Bennett Young did, where he got his law degree in Ireland. After amnesty, after the war was over, he came back and began practicing law in Louisville and became a man about town. He was not only a lawyer, but he was an historian. He was an antiquarian. He collected all sorts of early Kentucky artifacts. He was an author. He wrote at least 9 or 10 books, including a book called Confederate Wizards of the Saddle, which was 900 pages of glorifying the chivalry of the Southern soldier. He led the expo there in Kentucky in the 1890s. He was a vineyard. What do they call it when you're a vineyard. He had a vineyard. He was a vintner. Just a cool guy, if you ask him. He had his hand in so many things. He wrote children's books. He founded an orphanage for Black children in Louisville. He was friends with Black ministers in Louisville. He helped rewrite the Kentucky Constitution, and he addressed the issue of slavery, which had to be written out of the Constitution in a way that suggests that he knew, even though he had fought for the South, he knew that this was a thing of the past. This has been decided. Let's move past this. Let's acknowledge it and move past it and create a better tomorrow. So there was some of those Reconstruction sort of vibes were evident in his life. He also began to represent in federal court Black men and women who needed access to the courts. And so it's no surprise to me that George Denning was on his radar, and he sent Bill O'Bradley, the governor, a dispatch after Denning was convicted saying, "Do not let the sun set on this man in prison. You know that justice has been miscarried here. He needs freedom." And so eventually Bradley frees George Denning. Denning makes his way to and gives him a train ticket to Louisville. He has nothing back in Simpson County to return to. So he comes to Louisville, meets up with Bennett Young, goes on a speaking circuit of Black churches in Louisville, including the Fifth Street Baptist Church, where offerings are raised for him to help get him on his feet. Everybody knows that his property has been burned down and he's got nothing to return to. And so the entire Black community, many white people as well in Louisville, go in their pockets to help this guy, to help get him set up again. Eventually summons for his family down in Tennessee. They make their way up to Louisville. They go across the river. According to family lore, they're taken across the river in barrels. And nobody can tell me if they were hiding like inside barrels on a barge or if they were actually in barrels going across the river, but that's the family remembrance of this event. They were taken across the river in the way that so many people were, right in that spot, the end of, one branch of the Underground Railroad, taken across the river to Jeffersonville, Indiana, where George Denning buys a small home and starts reestablishing his family in Jeffersonville. As he's doing this speaking circuit of Black churches in Louisville, and as they're raising money for him, a story is written back in Simpson County in the Franklin Favorite that is very racist. It says Denning is profiting off the murder of one of our local sons. Essentially, he's a hoity-toity, uppity Black man in Louisville. He's getting all this money for speaking, for telling the story about killing Jody Kahn. They cast it in a light that makes George Denning a real villain. I don't know if that had anything to do with what came next, but and it also mentioned that Denning was considering suing in federal court the would-be lynchers, the vigilantes who had shown up on his porch that day. So about 8 weeks later, George Denning is attacked in Louisville, and I don't know how this went down. There's no police report. There is a hospital report. He got admitted to the hospital with missing one eye. Somebody had gouged out his eye, and somebody had cracked open his skull with a brick. He was attacked and he was left for dead in an alleyway on the west side of the city. Nobody was ever prosecuted for that, or I'm not even sure that it was necessarily investigated fully. But Denning, one would think that this might convince somebody to stop a federal lawsuit against the people who tried to kill him only a few years before. But he kept on, and this speaks to the courage of this man. And the reporters noted that when the federal case was brought to court, he was missing an eye. He had completely lost an eye. But Bennett Young represented him, and he did it with this kind of Kentucky vigor. He was a great orator. He used big words. he spoke in a way that that really represented his client and that made it almost theatrical, this case. And so many were called to testify, including the men who had been there that day, who had showed up at George Denning's in 1897, who had set fire to his house and so forth. And eventually the jury came back, at the risk of giving away part of the climax of the book. The jury had come back with a verdict in favor of George Denning, awarding him $50,000, which is equivalent to about $1.5 million in today's currency. So this was unheard of, that a Black man won in federal court against his would-be attackers, against these guys who had tried to bring vigilante justice to bear in a rural part of Kentucky. He never collected all that money. He never collected 10% of that money. He tried for the rest of his life to collect that money, including with the help of Bennett Young, who would constantly file lawsuits on his behalf. But many of the men were farmers down in Simpson County, and so they claimed indigence. They said they just didn't have it. A few of them paid up. All of them were on the hook for $9,999, but all those that were accused in that federal trial, but none of them paid even close to that amount. Denning's family all reestablished in Jeffersonville, Indiana. I've met many of his descendants. I don't see any of their names on today because I didn't really spread the word about this event, but they're good people. The thing that's interesting that's happened since the book came out is somebody has decided to try to erect an historical marker in Jeffersonville that acknowledges George Denning's role in the early civil rights movement, which I think is a pretty cool thing. Most of the Dennings, they, by the way, changed their name to D-E-N-N-I-N-G from D-I-N-N-I-N-G when they got to Jeffersonville. Most of them are buried in Eastern Cemetery in Jeffersonville, but George Denning's grave has unfortunately been lost to time. There was a flood, I think, of the Ohio in the 1930s, and they lost a bunch of burial records. And so nobody can point to the spot where George Denning is buried. But his family, I asked them in a talk similar to this, one of the questions from someone was, do you feel like justice was achieved in this court case? And, I put it to them. I said, would you all care to answer that? And to a person, they said, no, this is not, he was never paid back. He won in federal court, right? And it was a big deal. It was in all the newspapers. The New York Times was covering the federal case. That's how sort of sensational this was. But he's, to a person, they said, no, justice wasn't achieved. We lost our land. And that's such an important thing. That 124 acres in Simpson County does not belong to the Denning family anymore. They abandoned that, couldn't go back to it. And so the family's now trying to find a lawyer who might be able to see if it's possible for them to get that land back, which I think is an interesting development in all this. And I don't know if they'll have success, but a similar case played out in California recently, where a Black family, the Blake family, I think, had lost a resort to eminent domain and just recently got it back after 80 years, 90 years. So who knows if they'll have success in that regard, but I'm pleased as Punch to present this story primarily because we remember folks like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and and John Lewis, and we remember a lot of civil rights icons for good reason, for their bravery and their courage and so forth. But there are a lot of people who did things equally brave, who've been kind of forgotten or whose stories aren't as widely known. And so part of the pride I have in this book is just presenting the story of George Denning, for the first time in book form, at least, to fill in some of those gaps and to kind of acknowledge his role in that early civil rights movement, right? There's so much of history between Reconstruction and the sustained civil rights movement is white. And this is what we're talking about today. That I don't know if this is playing out in Kentucky, but the Republican governor of Florida is trying to ban the teaching of critical race theory. And, this is on the tip of the tongue now. But it's important to remember this stuff because so much of the written history was from a white perspective. And so many times, if you read about a Black person, unless it was like Booker T. Washington or sort of more white-friendly Black person, more often than not, it was because they were being marched to their deaths or because they had been, murdered by a mob the day before. And so this didn't work out like that. And I'm pleased as punch to put this out there. It's been pretty well received. And I hope that everybody gets a chance to read it. Happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Ben. Wow. I'm thrilled to learn this story. Being kind of a nerd for Kentucky history, professional nerd. I love this. And I think I appreciate that you channeled that grief into investigating this story. So if anybody does have questions, and I'm sure that there are some, please do put those in the chat. Richard wanted to know what's your current project that you're working on?
Great question. So I ghost wrote a book for a forensic anthropologist who is, she did all the work at the Dozier School. And by the way, I never know if people know about this. This was my sort of mission for the past 10 years, the Dozier School for Boys. It's recently gotten a lot of attention because Colson Whitehead, who won the Pulitzer Prize in fiction for a book called The Nickel Boys last year, that book is based on a true story of the Dozier School, which was my sort of investigative project for a long time. Anyways, I ghost wrote a book for the woman who's the forensic anthropologist who dug up all those bodies. And she's the one responsible for identifying a good number of them. She had to get permission from the state of Florida, which meant fighting like you wouldn't believe, because nobody wanted this part of Florida history known, so she faced severe odds and was successful. So I ghost wrote that book for her, but it took a lot out of me. It was harder than anything I've ever done. And so I'm going to take a bit of a sabbatical for the rest of this year, and then I'll come back with another project, hopefully next year.
And you have some physical recovery to do too, it sounds like. So yeah, a little break. And Jody just commented, she's the director of education here. And she said that the entire staff is just raving about your book. So you're hit with us professional nerds here at Cage.
Awesome. Well, do you guys know, is Bennett Young talked about? Because he was, Jessica?
Jessica, unmute, just unmute.
I was like, I can't fit all my questions. So I adore this book. And yes, Jody is like one of the people has had to listen to me talk about it. But I came upon Bennett Young through another historical site where he was the business partner of the dead rich white guy mansion, who is a very benevolent person. So when I first learned about Bennett Young, it was about his Presbyterian connection and his connection to Center College. So his father-in-law was Reverend Stuart Robinson, who was the president of Stuart College. That's an inside staff joke for Stuart, who went to Center College. But their work was for social betterment. They invested in education and helping the poor, the needy, the immigrant children especially.
Yeah.
So I learned about him also escaping from prison with Morgan's Raiders. Like, this guy seemed to be just the most fascinating, good-hearted man.
Yeah.
So my question is, like, in your book, and I was really excited to get to it because I was like, okay, now we're going to be able to understand how he got to these opposing truths. Like, how do you be so dedicated to the plight of the African American community? He tried to help desegregate public transportation in the 1870s.
Right.
How do you be so dedicated to these advancements but tout the lost cause and the meaning of the Confederacy so vehemently?
Yeah.
And you
More than
wrote, you were like,
anybody of his era. I mean, he raised the money for the Jeff Davis Memorial in where is that? Out near Hopkinsville. Yeah.
mhm. So
Um,
he's definitely talked about, but as an investor, a Confederate war general or colonel that invested in all these incredible social betterment causes in the name of Presbyterianism.
yeah. Well, and interestingly, Robinson was, Robinson was one of these guys who supported supported the institution of slavery using the Bible, which was not uncommon. And essentially, the doctrine was so many of the things that were so many of the things in the Old Testament that were written about as being okay, when culture changed and they were addressed again in the New Testament, like having multiple wives, for instance, comes up in the New Testament. Divorce, the concept of divorce is written about in the New Testament. It's frowned upon, that sort of thing. Slavery is never, his argument was that slavery was never repudiated in the New Testament of all these things. And therefore slavery should still be okay, acceptable. So I don't know. I'm so curious what those conversations were like between Young and Robinson when they both lived in Ireland, I think. And there's just no record that I could put my fingers on that gave me any insight into their differences or when Young had a change of heart,
And while they were in Ireland, Robinson wrote to, I don't know if he wrote to Lincoln or the governor at the time, on behalf of the Black community in Louisville because of their treatment after emancipation.
Oh, wow.
So he wrote a personal impassioned letter that the harassment of Blacks in Louisville has got to stop.
Yeah.
This is right after the war. So it's
it's fascinating. Can you imagine living through a period of time where you're a young person coming of age under one system that you inherit, right? So Young grew up alongside slaves. His father owned at least 6 slaves. So then the war comes, or the emancipation comes, then the war comes, and then after the war, so you fought for a thing, for a concept, for a structure. And then after, you have to try to figure out how we move forward from that. That's just such a tough thing. It's so interesting reading Young's writing about this, and also reading his, he did the keynote addresses at many of the unveilings of the Confederate statuary in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. He was there, not only raising money, but delivering keynote addresses. He was at he gave the keynote at the unveiling of the Lee statue on Jackson Square in New Orleans, I think. And but he talks about it as two different things. We honor and we move forward, you know? And a lot of times in the move forward phase, it's coupled with the embetterment of Black people, the societal embetterment of Black people, and like lending our energy to that effort. But I don't know where his change came, whether it was a dramatic, like something happened. If that's the case, he never wrote about it. He never acknowledged this moment. And he was a guy who acknowledged moments. Or whether it was something that was gradual and that you know, changed over time. But it wasn't, it's very clear to me that it was rooted in his Presbyterianism, you know, and his devotion to God and to what was right. And somehow that became clear to him later in life.
Interesting.
Fascinating guy. Founder of one of the founders of the Free Library in Louisville, one of the founders of the Filson Historic Society, you know, left behind a trove of books about early Kentucky man and, you know, and about the war and so forth. Such an interesting guy.
I've had a few more comments and questions. Deborah, she's also a staff member here, said, thank you for being willing to address such difficult and important topics. And I'm trying to scroll through questions and sometimes they want to disappear. Lucy says, you mentioned in the book that several members of the Kahn family came to the trial regularly. Do you know any more about their involvement in the trial or even the mob that night?
No, I don't. And I know that only one Kahn was in the mob that night, and that was Jody. I do know that his people were very well-to-do, and they had their hands in a number of different industries, including farming, including strangely, like raising rabbits, which is a big deal. They own the best homes in Logan County, but I don't know. I don't know what came of them. A lot of people have suggested that I should have done more. This is fair. I should have done more to try to, you know, I spend the epilogue of the book, essentially the last chapter of the book, with the Denning family, and someone wanted me to talk to the family of the would-be lynchers, like what happened to them, and I just didn't. I didn't have the time or interest in like tracking down what the great grandson of, you know, one of the Kahns might have felt about this event that happened long ago. But that's still out there if anybody wants to. I don't know much more than that they showed up and they were interested, and that Jody Kahn's father he was the proprietor of the estate after his son died. And so when his son was sued or named in that lawsuit, the defense of that money fell to him. And even though he was a wealthy man, I don't think he ever settled with George Denning. I don't think he ever paid him off in full.
They might be more reticent to talk about their ancestors being involved in a lynch mob.
Maybe or maybe not. Since the book has come out, I've heard from, you know, 5 or 6 people from that part of the country, from Simpson, Logan County, who are just interested, you know, like questions like that. We want to know more about our family history and this sort of thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. Elizabeth shared, she said, I was surprised to learn that my great-grandfather was on the jury that found him guilty of manslaughter. This was not a story that was passed on.
Wow.
Let's see. Man, I don't want to miss anything. Okay. Kathy wanted to know, were there ever any charges for those who burned and shot Denning? Were there any other mob violence or lynchings of Black citizens in that county or surrounding counties?
Yeah, so they never faced criminal charges. They only faced the civil charges for burning down his home and chasing his family off. There were other lynchings in Simpson County. A couple just before George Denning's ordeal, and you can read about those in the book. I would hesitate to offer details, except that I remember that one of them, I think the one that preceded the George Denning incident by just a few years, he was killed and his body was hung on a main road, and there was a note pinned to his chest that was a threat against the Black people in the area. And it's in the book, but I can't verbatim, I can't just remember it, but it said something like, "This is going to happen to you if you don't behave," and that was a common thing.
So Richard was pointing out, as we were discussing slavery, Richard was pointing out that in the ancient world, that slavery wasn't race-based.
Right.
And after a period of time, slaves were freed and given a stake for a new life.
Right.
It's a different situation.
Right.
And Jessica also said this, I guess contacting the family members of the lynch mob sounds like a great idea for Kentucky Ancestors, which is a program that we have here. And Margaret said, "Just love spending my lunch hour this way. Always such great programs with my friends." And we miss you, Margaret. Thanks so much to Ben. Very inspiring to see the passion for research and amazing storytelling. Very much agree. So.
Yeah.
Any more questions that anybody wants to ask, please feel free to put those in the chat, or we're probably safe to unmute if you want to do it like that.
I have another question.
What's that, Jessica?
Well, the way the book starts out, it's very clear, and it lays the groundwork for the idea of the honor, or I guess the dishonor, that would befall law enforcement for not keeping a prisoner safe.
Yeah.
There was the quote that they said, "It's a shame from which we'll never recover." There was the idea that you should resign if you fail to keep a suspect safe. And then this all culminates in the anti-lynching bill, I think of 1897, where it passes the Senate and the House, and the governor signs it, and it says that you can arm prisoners, or you have to resign your office at the sheriff, if you don't keep a prisoner safe. And I think there's even a fine to it.
Yeah, I held him financially liable as well.
What happened to that? What happened to that bill? And how did we move from, not only is it dishonorable for you to lose a prisoner before they receive their fair trial, but now, you started this conversation by these atrocities are committed at the hands of law enforcement.
Yeah.
How did we go so far?
Yeah. Well, so many of those, so much of that violence from that era was sort of directly descendant to the old slave patrols. These were, vigilante men hired by slave owners to do what they could to keep law and order, to mainly to prevent insurrection. And so they were given these were not deputized legal, sheriff's deputies. They were men, hired guns, hired by slaveholders to prevent insurrection. And so they could disrupt Black church services. They could go into Black homes. They could seize guns. They could, carry out their form of justice in whatever way they saw fit. And I think a lot of this type of activity was directly descendant from that. The granting of the granting of the rights of a guy like George Denning to actually own property upset a lot of people. Some of them who probably would have been involved in distributing vigilante justice during slavery times. So in some ways, it seems to me like this was more of just a carryover. A lot of people think this was, so only the Klan did lynchings, and that is just not true. This was not a Klan type thing. I know I bring up the Klan because the Klan was a threat, and it was something that was feared in that era, in that region. But this wasn't organized in the way that the Klan was. They did not mask themselves. They did disguise their voice, but they weren't wearing, the hoods that came with like the second Klan in the 1920s. So I don't know how to answer your question except to say that, they're like law enforcement has taken many shapes and forms over the years. And, Lord have mercy. Is there a tie between what these guys were doing in 1897 and the guys who used a battering ram to knock in Breonna Taylor's door in Louisville? Is there a link? Maybe. That's a tough thing, but that's what we're dealing with right now, right? We're having these conversations, and hopefully we get better, we get safer, we get more just in the distribution of, our laws.
I think that starts with looking at questions like this, about those connections there. So thank you for bringing that up. And Keith is looking forward to reading your book. So Keith is another staff member here. Jody says, this has been utterly fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing this story with us. Hope your healing is quick and complete.
Thank you, Jody.
So, and we hope you'll do more research on Kentucky, because you seem to have a knack for uncovering some fascinating stories. So we love that. So
well, I love your state. I had never, just a parting shot, I had never spent much time there, but boy, I sure found some beautiful people and beautiful countryside in southwestern Kentucky, both in Simpson and Logan counties, but also in Hopkinsville. And then, I never knew Louisville was such a cool place either. Didn't get to spend much time in Frankfort, unfortunately, but next time. But I had a good time there, and thank you for the invitation back. I'd love to come kick some rocks over.
Well, we would love to have you in Frankfurt. Ben, Jessica mentioned, it says Ben is friends with Jennifer Brown, who serves on our board.
Right.
Jennifer was actually who put me in contact with Ben. So we're grateful to have very active board members like her. So, all right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to seeing you next month for First Friday. Alan and Ben, don't go anywhere.
Yeah. Thank you. So long.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alan, or should I say Karen Czar, don't go anywhere.
I was just gonna say, Ben, I have your email address, so I know you're on sabbatical, but I might send a.
Oh no, hit me up, please, Jessica. Let's talk, because I want to know more about Stuart Robinson.
The Reverend Stuart Robinson.
Right.
I just have to say one last thing. In your book, you wrote founder of the Filson, Kentucky's Historical Society.
It's not right.
No, this is the Kentucky Historical Society.
You guys fight with the Filson Club?
It's Louisville's Historical Society.
Is there some?
No.
Very friendly ribbing between us and the Filson. We love them.
I read it and I was like, oh. I'm just kidding. Ben, thank you so much. Thank you. I'll reach out.
Thank you, Jessica. All right.
Alan, are you there?
I am here. Yes.
Oh, there we
go. Wow. What a fascinating. How you doing, Ben?
I'm good, Alan. This is a little disconcerting though, staring at Karen Czar's face.
Well, it's better. Actually, it's probably a better looking one, but let me turn myself on here.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. No, now you see I'm not Karen Czar, and I never will be. Not without some serious surgery. Anyway, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for eventually a history podcast. Fascinating story here, and one that has not been in the history books, has never made it into the history books. So why is that?
Well, it's a good question. So it has been written about by George Scott, who is a Kentucky historian. But it wasn't, it was just a small anecdote in a book, I think, called Violence in Kentucky, Racial Violence in Kentucky, something like that. So, but, it's one of those stories that has been overlooked, forgotten. I don't think it's been recognized for its seeming import. It's not a case that shines a wonderful light on the state of Kentucky. So that might have something to do with it. But it also was one of those that, was sensational in its day. It was covered by papers across the country. But then it just sort of petered out. I don't think there was any real hard ending to it. So it just kind of like went away. And that might speak to it as well.
And, when we're talking about a landmark case, if you will, but it ends with George being convicted of manslaughter. And herein lies the injustice. He was just minding his own business, and this mob just descends upon his house because he is an other, or he's been otherized.
Right.
And this is part and parcel of kind of the same type of situations that we see today.
Yeah, I think this has lots of echoes in today's society. Just the disenfranchise of a certain segment of the population, the fact that Denning, because of his race, was not extended the same protection from the law that others might expect to get. The fact that he was convicted by a jury that looked nothing like him. These are all injustices. And the beauty of this is, in the end, he went after that justice that he couldn't find in circuit court. He couldn't find in rural Kentucky. And so he felt like it was something that he could get in federal court. And that wasn't uncommon for Black Southerners. Often their only means of justice came through the federal court system. And in this case, he had to have the help of a white guy to get access to that system.
Let's talk about the extraordinary personage of Bennett Young, especially as it relates to this narrative.
Sure. Yeah, Young was a true son of the South, a son of Kentucky. He fought with Morgan's Raiders during the Civil War. He was imprisoned in Camp Douglas outside Chicago and escaped from there. He led the northernmost land action in the Civil War, which is this crazy Confederate raid out of Canada into New Albans, Vermont. And then, moved to Europe during those years after the war until he was granted amnesty, and he returned to Louisville and became sort of a man about town. He was well-to-do from a moneyed family, but he began practicing law and earned some money that way, and also became a businessman. He built railroads. He built one of the bridges connecting Louisville to Indiana. Beyond that, he led the Louisville Exposition, sort of the World's Fair in Louisville in the 1890s, and started representing people of color in federal court, which is, I think, a remarkable thing. Including Bennett Young, and he carried that case all the way through, and pro bono. He wasn't getting paid for it. He wanted to do what was right. Beyond that, he founded a Black orphanage, and I think the whole time, it's the founding of the Black orphanage, the representing of of Black people in the federal court system. The whole time he was doing that, he was also working on behalf of the establishment of the lost cause, the idea that the Southern soldier was chivalrous and should be honored in death. And he was raising money for the memorials that recognize the Confederacy, many of which were still, we're talking today about what we should do with.
Yeah, here's a person who is acknowledging the past and his role in it, but at the same time saying we need to move forward. And it reads like a tale of redemption, and possibly this idea that if you have prejudices in the past, that you need not always follow them, that you can turn over a new leaf and begin to see people in a different way, and to live your life as a different example.
Yeah, which I think is a lesson we still need to hear, sadly, right? But Bennett Young embodied that. After the war, he recognized that slavery was past, and he saw the way forward to include doing what he could to put Black citizens on equal footing with whites, and he worked in this regard. And that extended to again the founding of the Black orphanage there in Louisville, but also the giving Black men and women access to federal courts, because so often that's how it happened. You got justice in the federal court system, and so but it took a lot for a guy like George Denning to figure that system out. And so he was sort of a concierge for justice for a lot of people.
Talk a little bit about the legacy of the Denning family after the trial, after he was pardoned by the governor.
Yeah, well, they reestablished themselves in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where they lived for many years. The Denning family never got repaid the full amount that he won in federal court, which was equivalent to about $1.5 million in today's currency. They never got very much of that at all. But George Denning went to work as a Teamster, driving. When we say Teamster, we think of the mafia or whatever, the unions. But he was actually driving livestock back and forth from Jeffersonville into Louisville. His children grew up. They had some hard times, but they also had some good times. And eventually they were one of the first Black families to live on Spring Street, which at the time consisted of only white families in Jeffersonville, Indiana. So he lived for a pretty long time. He died in 1930. His wife, Molly, lived beyond him for another 14 years or so. Their descendants are good, successful, established people. I think of Anthony Denning, who owns his own barbershop in Indianapolis now, and cares a lot about this story. Helps tell this story. They're a proud people, but they also, I think, since this book has come out, since they know the rest of the story, some of the stuff that the family didn't talk about for years, they know about the loss of that land. They've decided to try to see what they can do about legally getting that land back, because it means a lot to them. It was land that their ancestor worked his butt off for and paid for, and then was chased off of. And so there's a level of injustice that remains in the family, and they want it back.
And in your presentation, and you alluded to it, this idea of critical race theory and the controversy that it stirs in certain political areas, let's say. Were it not for critical race theory, it's quite possible that this never gets taught in a classroom.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what the hubbub is about. I think it's the silliest thing in the world, and it's political red meat. In my mind, look, I remember in elementary school when I was in the 5th grade, 1989, we celebrated in Oklahoma. We celebrated the centennial of the land run, which went down in 1889. And all the white kids dressed up in pioneer garb, and they gave us all wooden stakes, and they lined us up on the edge of the playground, and they fired a gun, and they told us to run out and claim our property. And this was the recreation of the land run. In none of that do I remember having been taught that that land had previously been gifted to Native Americans who'd been driven to that property at gunpoint from points in the Southwest on the Trail of Tears. That was not taught. So what I got was we didn't realize we were recreating the theft of property again from a group that had been so put upon, that had been killed, had been forced to walk 900 miles to new land, and they were told they could inhabit this land for the rest of their lives. And the fact that that was never brought up to me in my history class is terrible. So I see this for what it is. Critical race theory is political red meat meant to get white people pissed off yet again. And if we don't talk about this stuff, if we don't talk about how we have failed and how we have done wrong to all sorts of people, then we're not, it's not history, it is a whitewashed version of history. And there are a lot of people who want to extend that as long as they can, that white version of history, like we are great people and didn't do anything wrong. And in my mind, that just does the next generation an injustice, a disservice.
Ben Montgomery, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it. The book is A Shot in the Moonlight: How a Freed Slave and a Confederate Soldier Fought for Justice in the Jim Crow South. And continued success.
Thank you so much, sir. Really appreciate it.
Guys, thank you all for being with us today. I'm trying to find my camera. There we go.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks for making this possible.
Oh, absolutely. Ben, that was fantastic. Thank you. That was a great discussion. And I always love that when lots of folks want to jump in and talk. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Feel better.
Yeah.
Karen, thanks you too.
Get better every day.
That's good to hear. Bye-bye.
See you next time. Thank you.